Power is not the same as action, and restraint is not the same as weakness. Right now, the United States is standing in that narrow, dangerous space between the two. On one side, Iran, protesters killed, a regime that survives by violence, a president who says, if they start killing again, we will hit them very hard. On the other side, silence, pause strikes, military assets still moving, a decision not made or not yet revealed. This is not hesitation, this is calculation. Because an airstrike does not guarantee collapse, and a collapse does not guarantee stability. History has taught America this lesson before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, the real question is not can the United States act, it is what happens after it does. If this kind of analysis matters to you, stay with me. Because to understand what comes next, we need to understand why this moment exists at all. The debate you are watching is not about Iran alone, and it is not really about Donald Trump either. It is about a deeper question, one that every great power eventually faces. When does force actually work? Inside Washington, the assessment was blunt. A strike would not guarantee the regime's collapse. More firepower would be required, more assets in the region, more risk to American forces. And yet, doing nothing has its own cost. Threats that are not backed up lose credibility. Regimes learn, they adapt, they harden. This is why the administration's tone feels muted, not softer, more constrained. The Iranian protests did not fracture the system. The security apparatus held. Violence tragically worked for now. So the choice is no longer binary. Strike or stand down. It is a question of how power is applied, overtly or quietly. And to understand why that distinction matters, we have to go back to how this standoff was built in the first place. To understand this moment, you have to zoom out beyond this week, beyond this administration. The Iranian regime was not built to collapse easily. It was designed to absorb pressure, external pressure, internal unrest. For decades, it has survived sanctions, isolation, covert pressure, and waves of protest, including 2009, the Green Movement, a moment when many believed the system might finally crack. It did not. Why? Because authoritarian systems do not fall when challenged, they fall when their enforcement mechanisms fail. In this case, they didn't. The security services held, the chain of command remained intact, and history matters here. In Syria, a red line was drawn and not enforced. In Iraq and Afghanistan, force was applied, and the aftermath proved harder than the invasion. These memories shape every decision now. They explain why quiet tools matter, cyber pressure, information access, behind-the-scenes support. Because once a regime has to kill at scale to survive, it reveals weakness, but also danger. And that leads us directly to the first real breaking point. Then the first crack appeared, not on a battlefield, but in the streets. When the protests spread, the regime faced a test it had avoided for years: use limited force and risk momentum, or escalate and expose itself. It chose escalation. People were killed in numbers that shocked even seasoned observers. This was not strength. This was survival mode. Because once a government must rely on mass violence, it signals something profound. Fear has replaced consent. And that moment triggered the warning from Washington. If the killing continued, action would follow. Hard action. But here is the paradox. A strike at that moment would not have liberated the protesters. It would have changed the story from citizens versus regime to nation versus foreign power. History is unforgiving on this point. External force often saves the very regimes it seeks to destroy. If you want real insight into how power actually works, this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because what looked like a moral breaking point was also a strategic trap, and avoiding that trap required restraint that looks to many like retreat, But the real mechanics lie deeper. What sits beneath all of this is a system most people never see. Power today is no longer just tanks and missiles, it is leverage, narrative, timing. The Iranian regime understands this well. That is why it restricts information, why it shuts down the internet, why it isolates protesters from the outside world, because control of information is control of momentum. On the other side, the United States also understands something hard-earned. Military force is loud, but it is rarely precise. Quiet pressure works differently. Cyber operations, information support, helping voices escape the blackout. These tools weaken a regime without unifying it. That is the hidden mechanism at play. Not regime change by invasion, but erosion. Slow, deliberate, relentless. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Once a regime is forced to kill in large numbers to survive, it has already crossed a line it cannot uncross. Every act of violence narrows its future. But shortcuts are tempting. Airstrikes promise clarity, decisiveness, an ending. History offers no evidence they deliver one, which brings us to the second escalation. More dangerous, more global. Then the tension moved outward, from streets to capitals. Military assets began to shift, quietly at first, then visibly, signals without speeches. Senators appeared in the region, messages hardened, taunts continued from Tehran. And this is where miscalculation lives, because deterrence is not about what you say, it is about what the other side believes you will do. The administration had pulled back once, not because it could not strike, but because it was not ready for what followed. No guarantee of collapse, no clean exit, no control over escalation. Yet every pause carries a cost. History teaches regimes to test limits, to probe restraint, to assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. That is the danger zone. If pressure resumes, if violence spikes again, if threats are ignored, the response next time does not have to mirror the last. This is why the region feels unstable even in silence, because silence is not de-escalation, it is anticipation. And while the focus remains on leaders and regimes, there is another dimension often overlooked. What all of this does to ordinary people. That is where the real consequences begin. If you are watching this from a distance, it can feel abstract. Strategy, deterrence, credibility. But for you, if you are an ordinary citizen caught inside a system like this, there is nothing abstract about it. You live between fear and uncertainty, between hope and punishment. When the internet goes dark, your voice disappears. When protests rise, you weigh courage against survival. And when foreign powers threaten force, you are the one who pays first. This is the cruel reality of geopolitical pressure. It is meant to target regimes, but it lands on people. That is why quiet support matters, why information matters, why visibility matters. Because when the world is watching, violence becomes more costly. And when it stops watching, brutality lasts longer. If this resonates with you, share it, talk about it, keep attention alive. Power responds to pressure, but only when pressure is sustained. And as these forces collide locally, their consequences do not stay contained. They travel, they ripple, and next they reach the global system itself. What happens inside one country rarely stays there, especially when power vacuums form. Iran is not just a domestic crisis, it sits at the center of energy markets, regional security, great power competition. Every signal sent in Tehran is read in Moscow, in Beijing, in allied capitals across Europe. This is where the stakes multiply. If threats are not enforced, adversaries adjust their expectations. They assume limits, red lines that fade. And allies notice too. They ask whether commitments are conditional, whether protection is permanent. This logic does not stop with Iran. It spills into debates over NATO, over territorial pressure, over whether leverage replaces rules. When power looks transactional, the global order becomes negotiable. That is how local restraint can be misread as global retreat. And that misreading is dangerous, because once multiple actors begin testing the same system at once, crisis stops being isolated. It becomes structural. The world does not collapse in a single decision. It erodes through accumulated signals. And that brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? Not emotionally, not ideologically, but structurally. That is where the future divides into paths. There are 3 paths forward from here. None of them are clean. The first is the optimistic path. Pressure continues quietly. Information flows improve. The regime's reliance on violence deepens its internal fractures. Over time, legitimacy erodes faster than control can compensate. Change comes from within, slowly, unpredictably, but without a regional war. The second path is the middle one. The most likely, the regime survives, weaker, more paranoid, more repressive. The United States maintains pressure without escalation. Deterrence holds barely. This produces stability without resolution, years of tension, periodic crises, a frozen conflict that never truly freezes. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one, a miscalculation, a test that goes too far, a response meant to restore credibility and instead ignites escalation. Force is applied without a clear political endgame. The region reacts, allies are pulled in, adversaries exploit the chaos. History shows how fast this path closes options. What determines which future emerges is not strength alone. It is discipline, timing, and an understanding that power once used cannot be recalled. The question now is not which path is possible. It is which one leaders are prepared to manage. And that brings us to the final reckoning. This moment will not be remembered for a single strike or a single speech. It will be remembered for what was resisted. Power is easy to display, harder to control. The true test of leadership is not whether force can be used. It is whether it is used at the right moment, for the right reason, with a future clearly in mind. Iran exposes the central paradox of modern power. Act too little, and brutality endures. Act too much, and systems collapse in ways no one can manage. There are no clean victories left, only trade-offs. And the most dangerous illusion is believing that strength alone guarantees outcomes. History does not reward impatience. It punishes arrogance. If you take one insight from this analysis, let it be this. The world is not destabilized by weakness. It is destabilized by poorly applied strength. If you want to understand how the next global crisis forms before it explodes, stay here, subscribe, and watch closely, because the next decision will not announce itself as a turning point. It never does.